At first glance, Iran looks pretty powerful. Its proxy, Hamas, has dealt a crippling blow to Israel without requiring direct Iranian involvement. It's got the power and geopolitical confidence to strike targets abroad, as demonstrated by the recent strikes in Iraq and Pakistan. And sanctions imposed by Trump in 2018 have been largely ineffective. Oil and non-oil revenues have climbed to a recent high, and reports suggest that Iran is on track to acquire its own nuclear weapons sometime this year. But if you look deeper, it becomes clear that Iran isn't actually as strong as it appears. Despite rising revenues, Iran's economy is a mess. The regime is perhaps less popular than at any time since 1979, and a succession crisis looms as Iran's supreme leader enters his 85th year without an obvious replacement. And this is why Iran has been moving towards rapprochement with Saudi Arabia recently, and why, despite its apparent strengths, Iran has tried to stay out of the escalating conflict in the Middle East. Iran has stressed on multiple occasions that it had no direct involvement with the Hamas attacks on October 7th. And while the Houthis, another Iranian proxy, have been pretty aggressive in disrupting maritime trade in the Red Sea, Iran's main and least independent proxy, Hezbollah, have been conspicuously quiet. Like Iran, Hezbollah have stressed that they had nothing to do with October 7th and contented themselves with sporadic missile strikes across the Lebanon-Israel border, despite the plight of Hamas and the increasingly bellicose rhetoric coming from Israeli officials suggesting a full-on invasion of southern Lebanon. Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, has become renowned for his ridiculously long and impressively vacuous speeches. His first one on November 3rd was nearly an hour and a half long and full of dramatic platitudes, but the only substantial bits in there came about halfway through, when Nasrallah insisted October 7th was, quote, 100% Palestinian, and basically said that Hezbollah wouldn't be escalating because Hezbollah was, in Nasrallah's words, already at war with Israel. In fact, the Iranians themselves, who are usually pretty keen on furious Islamic-tinged anti-American speeches, have also sounded far more dovish than usual. A manifesto by senior Islamic clerics published in mid-October actually condemned the killing of civilians by Hamas, and in a story that went very much underreported at the time, on October 27th, Iran voted in favor of a two-state solution for the first time ever at the UN General Assembly, implicitly recognizing Israel's right to exist. In this light, then, the recent missile strikes look less like an escalation so much as a defensive maneuver, an attempt to deter Israel or the US from escalating against Hezbollah and the Houthis without inviting a direct response. Now, it's important not to overstate this, or interpret this as a fundamental shift in Iranian foreign policy. Iran is still an Islamic theocracy, and death to America and death to Israel are still popular refrains in Iranian foreign policy. Nonetheless, even if it's motivated by geopolitical pragmatism or self-preservation among the Ayatollahs, it's clear that Iran doesn't want a war and simply can't afford it. So in this video, we're going to explain why Iran is weaker than it seems, how this explains the dovish pivot in Iranian foreign policy recently, and why, even if Iran doesn't want a war, it doesn't mean that it won't end up getting one. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's get straight into it. As we see it, there are three distinct but related crises affecting Iran at the moment. An economic crisis, a political crisis, or what we might describe as a crisis of legitimacy, and a looming succession crisis. Let's start with the economic crisis. To understand Iran's economic crisis, you really need to know two things about the Iranian economy. Firstly, it's very dependent on hydrocarbon revenues. That's because Iran has 10% of the world's proven oil reserves and 15% of its gas reserves. And as such, hydrocarbon revenues usually account for about half of all of government revenue. Secondly, Iran's economy is mostly centrally planned. About 60% of all Iranian economic activity is directed by the government, who also set price controls for stuff like food and energy, and the private sector is actually pretty weak. Anyway, these two facts actually explain Iran's current economic crisis. That's because Iran's hydrocarbon export revenues have been steadily diminished by escalating Western sanctions aimed at undermining Iran's nuclear weapons programs. Now, the US first imposed sanctions all the way back in 1996, but they were joined by other Western nations in the 2000s after the International Atomic Energy Agency concluded that Iran had violated the Nuclear Weapons Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, sanctions were temporarily relaxed in 2015 after Obama negotiated the JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. But Iran's recovery at the time was limited by low oil prices in the mid-2010s, and Trump then reimposed sanctions in 2018. Now, while Trump's sanctions have become less effective over time, as Iran has figured out how to get around them, they nonetheless triggered a dramatic decline in Iran's oil exports, which fell from a high of nearly 2 million barrels in 2017 to less than 500,000 barrels a day in 2020. Since then, they have risen to over 1 million barrels a day, but this is still lower than the pre-sanction levels. And while the data is a bit fuzzy because Iran doesn't publish reliable statistics, the latest IMF estimate suggests that Iran's GDP per capita has basically halved since 2012. Now, coping with Western sanctions and a 50% drop in revenues would be a challenge for even a competent government. But Iran's current regime, which again controls most of Iran's national economy, is perhaps the most incompetent in Iran's theocratic history. The Ayatollahs responded to this crisis by essentially printing money, but that hasn't worked, and inflation has been running at about 50% for the last 5 years, causing the poverty rate to essentially double to 30% and leading youth unemployment to rise to 25%. The regime also spends absurd amounts of money on subsidies. Take petrol, for example, which is currently subsidized to 2 cents a litre. This subsidy costs the equivalent of billions of dollars a year and only encourages rampant overuse. The average Iranian now consumes between 5 and 10 times as much petrol as the average Turk, for example, despite being less than half as wealthy. In fact, Iran uses so much petrol that they've been importing it recently, despite nominally being one of the world's biggest oil exporters. So the Iranian state simply can't afford to fund both these subsidies and Iran's nationalized industries, which is why the government is currently running a dangerously massive budget deficit. As such, the government apparently needs to export 1.5 million barrels of oil per day at an average price of $85 in order to balance its budget. But in part thanks to lower demand from China, Iran is only selling about 1.2 million barrels a day, and it's getting nowhere near $85 per barrel. Internationally, oil is only trading at about $75 per barrel, but Iran has had to sell it at a 10% discount to make up for the sanctions risk. Lower numbers and lower exports mean that Iran's oil revenues are only at about 60% of what's required. So Iran is apparently on track to run an unprecedented budget deficit of nearly 7 trillion rial, the highest in Iran's history. This has forced the Iranian state to do a whole load of unpopular cost-cutting exercises, including cutting food and medicine subsidies, raiding the public pension fund, and exhausting the sovereign wealth fund. Which leads us nicely into the second crisis, Iran's political crisis. Now, unsurprisingly, this economic dysfunction has strained relations between the ruling Ayatollahs and ordinary Iranians. But these tensions have also been exacerbated by two other things. Firstly is growing inequality. And it's not just that Iranian elites are way wealthier than ordinary Iranians, although they are. It's also that Iran suffers from acute regional and ethnic inequality. Government policies have consistently benefited Iran's wealthier central regions, which are dominated by ethnic Persians, at the expense of its poorer outer regions, which often have larger minority populations. In 2018, provinces like Balochistan in southeastern Iran had a poverty rate of roughly 5 times that of Tehran. And in 2021, there were protests in the Arab-majority province of Khuzestan after a government project to redirect water to Iran's central provinces triggered a catastrophic drought. The second exacerbating factor is the widening ideological divide between the ruling clerics and your average Iranian. When they came to power in 1979, the Iranians considered the Ayatollahs far too conservative, and the regime actually ended up executing many of the students and leftists who had supported the revolution in the first place. But this divide has only widened as the Iranian public has become more liberal, and there were widespread protests last year after the ultra-conservative morality police killed a young woman for not wearing her hijab properly. Which brings us to the third issue, Iran's succession crisis. Supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who replaced Ayatollah Khomeini after his death in 1989, is now 84 years old, but has so far refused to nominate a deputy, and therefore has no obvious successor. The other obvious choice would be the incumbent president Ebrahim Raisi, but he's proven to be an incompetent administrator and would probably be too conservative for the Iranian public. Now, the previous president, Hassan Rouhani, has a better record in government, but is mistrusted by the clerics. But there have been some rumors that Khomeini has been grooming his second son, Mojtaba, for the position. But this would be risky. History suggests that incompetent family dynasties don't survive long in Iran. Anyway, the ambiguity over who succeeds Khomeini means that many analysts expect a sustained period of elite infighting once he steps down. This is particularly dangerous for the regime, given that the Iranian public are basically in a constant state of unrest, and elite divisions, combined with public upset, could genuinely bring the regime down. This is sort of what happened in 1979, when the army ditched the Shah after persistent protests, forcing him to flee. So those are Iran's 3 crises, and obviously a war with Israel would exacerbate all 3 of these. Economically, Iran just doesn't have the money to more actively support its proxies, let alone wage a full-blown war. Politically, further regional instability, especially if it requires some sort of mobilization, will only stoke public anger. And finally, any succession would have to be delayed until the end of a conflict, and any war, especially one Iran could lose, would make the process more contentious and risky for the regime. You've no doubt been following along with the news from Israel and Gaza, but if you want a better understanding, to dive deeper into the history of the region, then you should check out Real Life Law's hour-long documentary about the tensions and fighting between Israel and Gaza going back decades. It's a superb way to brush up on the history of this region, giving colour and context to what's happening right now. That video, by the way, is part of Real Life Law's Modern Conflicts series, where they regularly run through major ongoing conflicts, from Lebanon's civil war to everything going on in Myanmar and the Turkish-Kurdish conflict. It's an incredible series, and it's exclusively available on our streaming service, Nebula. As you likely know, Nebula is the streaming service that we built with a bunch of our creator friends, and is home to tons of smart educational content. The best part is that by signing up, you not only get access to exclusive series like Modern Conflicts, China Actually from Polymatter, or The Logistics of X from Wendover Productions, it also directly supports TLDR. That's because you signing up contributes to the budgets of these big documentaries and helps us to grow and expand our ambitions. So if you want to sign up, use the link below, because that not only supports us directly, but it also gets you a Nebula annual plan for 40% off. That's less than £2 a month, which is an incredibly good price for an independent streaming service, which not only supports creators, but also provides you with tons of ad-free exclusive content. Anyway, thanks for your support and for backing Nebula.